In the midst of a raging storm, a homeless man risks everything to save a stranded pregnant woman. What begins as a selfless act of kindness leads to an extraordinary connection and a life-changing revelation about who she really is. This powerful story will remind you that even the smallest acts of bravery can create ripples of transformation. Before we deep dive into this interesting story, tell us, where are you watching from? Share in the comments below. The streets of Chicago pulsed with life, but for Marcus Reed, they were a constant reminder of how far he had fallen. Once a promising musician with dreams of making it big, Marcus now walked the cracked sidewalks with a battered duffel bag slung over his shoulder. His clothes, though worn and patched, were meticulously clean, a silent testament to his pride in maintaining dignity despite his circumstances. The city was unforgiving to someone in Marcus's position. Each day was a battle to find food, a safe spot to sleep, and some semblance of normalcy in a world that barely noticed him. He had learned to navigate the sharp edges of judgment in strangers' eyes, the way people clutched their belongings tighter when he walked by, or crossed the street to avoid him altogether. As the morning light broke through the skyscrapers, Marcus began his usual routine. His first stop was a local shelter, where he hoped to get a cup of coffee and perhaps a sandwich. The line was long, filled with faces that mirrored his own struggles, and the staff worked briskly but kindly. Marcus thanked them with a polite smile as he received his meal, pocketing half of the sandwich for later. The city's sounds, the honking of horns, the murmur of conversations, and the occasional siren were both familiar and numbing. Marcus often passed the time at a small park, sitting on a bench with his notebook, sketching rough lyrics or humming melodies to himself. Music had once been his lifeline, and though life had stripped away nearly everything else, he refused to let go of his passion. Despite his struggles, Marcus had a heart big enough to share. As he sat in the park that day, a young boy wandered over, his face streaked with tears. His mother trailed behind, frantically searching her purse. "I dropped my wallet somewhere," she explained, her voice shaking. Marcus stood, his tall frame slightly stooped from the weight of his duffel bag. "I've got some bus fare," he said, offering her a few crumpled bills. The woman hesitated, looking at Marcus's worn appearance, but the gratitude in her eyes won out. "Thank you," she whispered. "I'll pay it forward." Marcus simply nodded, his gaze soft but distant. It wasn't about recognition or repayment. It was about doing what was right, even when he had little to give. That evening, the weather took a sudden and violent turn. Dark clouds rolled in, and the city was soon drenched in a torrential downpour. Marcus hurried through the streets, his feet splashing in puddles as he sought shelter. His usual spot by the church steps was already occupied, so he made his way to a bridge at the edge of the city. The bridge offered little protection from the wind that howled through the gaps, but it was better than nothing. Marcus leaned against a concrete pillar, pulling his coat tighter around him. Lightning illuminated the skyline in flashes, casting eerie shadows across the graffiti-strewn walls. As he huddled there, shivering, Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that this storm was different, not just in its ferocity, but in the way it seemed to carry a strange, unspoken tension. It was as if the city itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. And for Marcus, it would be the night that changed everything. The storm raged on with unrelenting fury, the rain hammering down in sheets against the city streets. Victoria Hayes gripped the steering wheel of her sleek black luxury SUV, her knuckles white as lightning split the sky. She had taken a wrong turn trying to avoid a flooded main road, and now she was stranded on a desolate stretch of street at the city's edge. The engine sputtered once, twice, and then fell silent. Her heart raced as she tapped her phone, but the signal was non-existent. "No service?" she muttered, her voice trembling. Water pooled around the wheels, the rising flood threatening to trap her. A sharp pain rippled across her abdomen, and she gasped, placing a hand on her pregnant belly. "Stay calm," she told herself, inhaling shakily. "Help will come." But with each passing second, the storm's intensity grew, and the isolation felt suffocating. Marcus Reed spotted the car through the cascading rain as he trudged along the roadside, his hood pulled tight against the wind. The SUV's hazard lights flickered weakly, their reflection rippling in the water that now coated the street. He paused, his instincts honed by years of survival on the streets. Something about the scene felt urgent. Off in the distance, the water levels were climbing fast, and the car sat precariously close to a low embankment. As he approached, he could see the outline of a woman in the driver's seat, her silhouette illuminated by the occasional flashes of lightning. She looked panicked, her head darting from side to side as if searching for a way out. "Hey!" Marcus called, his voice barely audible over the storm. He stepped closer, waving a hand to get her attention. Victoria's head snapped up, her eyes wide with fear as she rolled the window down an inch. "Who are you?" she asked, her voice shaky. "Name's Marcus," he said quickly. "Your car's stuck and this water's rising fast. You need to get out of here." She hesitated, her gaze flicking between him and the encroaching water. He didn't look like someone she would normally trust. His worn clothes and soaked duffel bag made her wary. But the urgency in his voice cut through her doubt. I can't walk far," she admitted, gesturing to her stomach. Marcus nodded, his expression softening as he noticed her condition. "All right, we'll take it slow," he said. "But we've got to move now." Without waiting for her response, Marcus opened the door, water splashing over his boots as he steadied the vehicle against the current. He extended a hand toward Victoria, his eyes meeting hers. "Trust me," he said simply. She hesitated for only a moment before gripping his hand, her nails digging into his palm as she stepped out into the water. Marcus adjusted his stance, using his body as a shield against the rushing wind and rain. "We'll head to higher ground," he said, guiding her toward a nearby incline. The road was slippery, and Victoria winced with each step, her free hand clutching her belly. Marcus stayed close, his other arm braced around her shoulder to keep her steady. When a fallen tree blocked their path, Marcus didn't hesitate. "Hold on to this signpost," he instructed, helping her balance before scrambling to clear the debris. His movements were quick but calculated, a testament to his resourcefulness and calm under pressure. "You're doing great," he reassured her, offering his hand again once the path was clear. "We're almost there." As they reached a safer spot under the shelter of a nearby overpass, Marcus finally had a chance to catch his breath. He glanced at Victoria, noticing details that stood out even amidst the chaos. Her tailored trench coat was soaked but clearly expensive, the type of item he had only seen in shop windows. Her shoes, though practical, bore the insignia of a luxury brand. Even her leather tote, now water-streaked, had the polished look of someone accustomed to a life far removed from his own. "You all right?" he asked, his voice gentle. Victoria nodded, though her expression was distant, as if processing the ordeal. "Thank you," she said softly, her gaze dropping to the duffel bag slung over his shoulder. Marcus followed her line of sight, suddenly self-conscious about his appearance. "Just the essentials," he said with a faint smile. Victoria studied him for a moment, her brow furrowing. "You didn't have to help me," she said, "especially in this weather." Marcus shrugged, his tone matter-of-fact. "You needed help. Doesn't matter who you are or what you've got, it's the right thing to do." Her eyes lingered on him, a flicker of something unspoken crossing her face. For the first time that night she smiled, albeit faintly. Not many people think like that. Marcus chuckled lightly, leaning against the wall of the overpass. Maybe more should. As the rain began to let up, Victoria fumbled for her phone, relieved to see a signal bar finally appear. She called for assistance, her voice steady now as she relayed their location. Marcus stood a short distance away, giving her space while silently debating whether to stay or leave. When Victoria hung up, she turned to him, her expression a mixture of gratitude and curiosity. "Help's on the way," she said. "I don't know how to thank you." "You just did," Marcus replied with a small nod. But as Victoria studied him, the weight of her gratitude seemed to deepen. It was clear to both of them that their worlds couldn't be more different, yet in that moment, none of it mattered. The relentless rain showed no signs of easing as Marcus guided Victoria along the slick, uneven path. Each step was a struggle, the ground muddy and treacherous, and the howling wind made it nearly impossible to hear anything but the storm's wrath. "Hold on to me," Marcus said firmly, his voice cutting through the chaos. "Just a little further, and we'll be safe." Victoria clung to his arm, her other hand pressed protectively against her swollen belly. Fear flickered in her hazel eyes, but she nodded, trusting this stranger who had appeared out of nowhere to save her. Lightning split the sky again, illuminating their precarious route. A stream of water surged across the ground ahead of them, and Marcus stopped abruptly. "Stay here," he instructed, steadying her against a lamppost. He moved quickly, testing the ground to ensure it was solid before turning back to her. "All right," he said, extending his hand. "We'll move together." Victoria hesitated for a moment, but the determination in Marcus's eyes gave her the courage to take his hand. Together, they crossed the rushing water, Marcus holding her arm tightly to keep her balanced. When they finally reached the overpass where Marcus had sought shelter earlier, Victoria sank down onto a dry patch of concrete, her chest heaving as she tried to catch her breath. "You okay?" Marcus asked, crouching beside her. His own clothes were soaked, water dripping from his hood onto the ground, but his focus was entirely on her. Victoria nodded, though her face was pale. "I've never been so scared in my life," she admitted. "You're safe now," Marcus said softly. "That's what matters." As the storm raged on around them, the overpass provided a temporary sanctuary. Marcus leaned back against the concrete wall, watching Victoria as she shifted uncomfortably, her hands fidgeting in her lap. "You need to rest," Marcus said, his voice calm but insistent. "Stress isn't good for you or the baby." Victoria offered a faint smile. "Easier said than done," she replied. Marcus reached into his duffel bag and pulled out a slightly crumpled granola bar. "Here," he said, holding it out to her. "It's not much, but you need to keep your strength up." She hesitated, then accepted it. "Thank you," she said, her voice tinged with genuine gratitude. For a few moments they sat in silence, the sound of rain echoing around them. Finally, Victoria spoke, her tone cautious. "You seem different from most people I've met." Marcus chuckled, the sound warm despite the cold night. "I'll take that as a compliment," he said. "Though I'm guessing that means you don't meet many people like me." Victoria's eyes flickered with a mix of amusement and sadness. "Not exactly," she admitted. "But that doesn't mean I don't appreciate what you've done for me. You didn't have to help." Marcus shrugged. "Didn't seem like a choice. You needed help, and I was there." She studied him for a moment, her gaze lingering. "Why were you out there anyway?" Marcus's expression shifted, a shadow of something unspoken passing over his face. "I was looking for a dry place to wait out the storm," he said simply. Victoria tilted her head, sensing there was more to his story but deciding not to press. After a moment, Marcus spoke again, his voice quieter now. "I wasn't always on the streets, you know." Victoria glanced at him, her interest piqued. "You used to have a place, a job, a life," Marcus continued. "I was a musician, played the piano mostly, but I could handle a guitar or two if needed." He smiled faintly, the memory bringing a brief warmth to his face. "Played in clubs, bars, even a few fancy places downtown." "What happened?" Victoria asked softly. Marcus sighed, his gaze distant. "Life, I guess. My mom got sick, and the bills started piling up. Had to sell the piano first, then the car. Did what I could, but it wasn't enough." He shook his head. "After she passed, I just drifted. One thing after another, and here I am." Victoria's expression softened, her own worries momentarily eclipsed by the weight of his story. "I'm sorry," she said. Marcus offered a small smile. "We all have our struggles," he said. "What about you? You don't exactly look like someone who spends much time in places like this." Victoria hesitated, her fingers tightening around the strap of her bag. "It's complicated," she said carefully. Marcus raised an eyebrow but didn't push. "Complicated usually means important," he said lightly. She looked away, her gaze fixed on the rain falling just beyond the overpass. "Let's just say I'm not used to needing help," she said finally, "and I'm not sure I deserve it." Marcus frowned, her words stirring a mix of curiosity and concern. "Everyone deserves help," he said firmly, "no matter who they are or what they've done." Victoria's eyes flicked back to him, her expression unreadable. "You really believe that?" I do, Marcus said without hesitation. For a moment, the two of them sat in silence, the storm raging on around them. Victoria's cryptic words lingered in Marcus's mind, but he chose not to press further. He could tell she wasn't ready to share more, and he respected that. But as he watched her, he couldn't shake the feeling that there was far more to her story than she was letting on. The storm had finally begun to ease, the torrential downpour tapering into a steady drizzle. The sky remained a patchwork of angry gray clouds, but the thunder was distant now, rumbling faintly as if retreating. Under the overpass, Marcus stood, his shoulders slouched from exhaustion, yet his focus remained on Victoria. "We should get moving," Marcus said gently, his voice breaking the heavy silence. "The rain might be slowing, but this area floods fast. We need to get you somewhere safe." Victoria nodded, her pale face still etched with weariness, though relief had softened her features. With Marcus's help, she rose to her feet, gripping his arm for balance. Together, they made their way down the damp, slippery path toward the main road. The air was thick with the earthy smell of rain-soaked concrete and wet foliage. Marcus kept a steadying hand on Victoria's arm as she navigated the uneven ground, her steps slow and cautious. When they reached the road, Marcus spotted the glow of headlights in the distance. He raised his hand, waving down the approaching vehicle, a tow truck making its rounds to assist stranded drivers. The truck pulled over, its tires splashing through shallow puddles, and a burly man in a reflective vest stepped out. "You folks okay?" the driver asked, eyeing them with concern. "She needs a ride somewhere safe," Marcus replied. "Her car's stuck further back." The driver nodded, glancing at Victoria. "Hop in. I'll take you where you need to go." Victoria turned to Marcus, her eyes glistening with gratitude. "I don't know how to thank you," she said, her voice trembling. "You saved me and my baby tonight." Marcus shifted uncomfortably, shrugging. "I just did what anyone should do." She reached into her bag, pulling out a slim wallet. "At least let me give you something," she said, holding out a small stack of cash. Marcus's brow furrowed and he shook his head. "That's not why I helped you," he said quietly. "I know," Victoria said, her tone earnest. "But you deserve this. Please, take it." After a moment's hesitation, Marcus reluctantly accepted the money, tucking it into his pocket. "Thank you," he said softly, though he looked away as if embarrassed. As Victoria climbed into the tow truck, she paused and turned back to Marcus. Her hand moved to the strap of her bag, and she pulled out a small, elegant business card. "Here," she said, stepping closer to hand it to him. "If you ever need anything, call me. I mean it." Marcus took the card, his fingers brushing hers briefly. The card was simple but striking, with embossed gold lettering that read, "Victoria Hayes." Below her name was a company logo he didn't immediately recognize, and a phone number printed in sleek, minimalist font. "Victoria Hayes," he murmured, the name rolling off his tongue with a faint sense of familiarity. Victoria offered him a faint smile. "Take care of yourself, Marcus," she said, her voice filled with sincerity. "You too," he replied, watching as she climbed into the truck and closed the door. The tow truck pulled away, its taillights glowing red against the gray haze of the lingering storm. Marcus stood there for a moment, the card still in his hand, feeling the weight of the evening settle over him. He turned the card over, running his thumb across the smooth surface. The name, Victoria Hayes, nagged at the back of his mind, like a song he couldn't quite place. There was something familiar about it, but he couldn't pin it down. Pocketing the card, Marcus adjusted the strap of his duffel bag and began walking back toward the city. The world around him felt quieter now, the storm's roar replaced by the soft patter of rain and the distant hum of cars. As he walked, Marcus couldn't help but reflect on how different their lives were. Victoria's polished demeanor and luxurious belongings stood in stark contrast to his own tattered clothes and uncertain future. Yet, for a few hours that night, their worlds had intersected in a way that felt strangely significant. "Wonder what someone like her is really doing out here," Marcus muttered to himself, shaking his head. He pushed the thought aside, focusing instead on finding a warm spot to rest for the night. What Marcus couldn't know, as he walked back into the city, was just how much that fleeting encounter would alter the course of his life. The faded television in the corner of the shelter flickered to life, casting a dim glow over the room. Marcus sat at one of the tables, nursing a cup of lukewarm coffee and glancing over the job listings in an old newspaper. The hum of muted conversations filled the air, punctuated occasionally by the sharp clang of trays in the small kitchen. "Turn that up," someone called, pointing toward the TV. The room quieted as a local news anchor's voice rose in volume. "In today's top story, Hayes Enterprises has announced a groundbreaking initiative to support affordable housing projects across the country," the anchor said. CEO Victoria Hayes unveiled the program earlier this morning during a press conference. Marcus froze, his heart skipping a beat, as the screen cut to footage of Victoria standing at a podium. Dressed in a tailored navy suit, her hair impeccably styled, she addressed the crowd with calm authority. "Our mission has always been about building more than just businesses," Victoria said, her voice steady yet warm. "We aim to create lasting impact, to lift communities, and to give opportunities to those who need them most." Marcus's mind reeled as he watched her speak. The woman on the screen, commanding attention with every word, was the same person he had guided through a storm just days ago. The camera panned to show the crowd, a sea of applause erupting as Victoria finished her speech. The chyron at the bottom of the screen read, "Victoria Hayes, CEO of Hayes Enterprises, leading philanthropic efforts in housing reform." Marcus sat back in his chair, his hands gripping the edges of the table. His mind flashed back to that night under the overpass, the rain pounding around them, her frightened expression as she clung to his arm. The disparity between the woman he'd met and the one now gracing the TV was staggering. "That's her," he muttered under his breath, his voice barely audible. A man sitting nearby glanced over. "You know her?" Marcus hesitated, unsure how to respond. "We crossed paths," he said vaguely, his eyes still fixed on the screen. The newscast continued, detailing Hayes Enterprises' vast empire and Victoria's reputation as a trailblazer in both business and philanthropy. As Marcus listened, a mix of emotions churned within him: surprise, admiration, and a growing sense of disbelief. Leaning back in his chair, Marcus let his thoughts drift to that stormy night. He replayed their conversations, the way she had carefully chosen her words. "Let's just say I'm not used to needing help," she'd said, her voice tinged with vulnerability. He'd brushed it off at the time, too focused on keeping her safe to dwell on the weight of her statement. Her reluctance to share more about herself now made sense. She hadn't wanted her wealth or status to define their interaction. In that moment, she hadn't been a powerful CEO. She'd simply been a woman in distress, relying on a stranger for help. Marcus recalled the way she had looked at him when she handed him her card, her gaze lingering as if she wanted to say more. The memory stirred something in him, a faint hope that perhaps their encounter had left as much of an impression on her as it had on him. Still, doubt crept in. People like Victoria Hayes lived in a world far removed from his own. Could she truly remember someone like him? Or had the card been a polite gesture, forgotten as soon as the storm passed? Marcus stared down at his hands, his fingers brushing against the edge of the crumpled card in his pocket. He'd kept it, though he hadn't dared to use it. What would he even say? "Hi, I'm the guy who helped you during that storm. Do you remember me?" The thought made him chuckle bitterly. She had seemed genuine in her gratitude, but that didn't mean she owed him anything. And yet, a part of him couldn't shake the feeling that their encounter had been more than just a coincidence. Why didn't she tell me who she was? He wondered aloud, his voice quiet but tinged with frustration. Perhaps it was humility, or perhaps she had wanted to see if he would help her without knowing her status. Either way, it didn't change the fact that their worlds were miles apart. Marcus had spent years scraping by, while Victoria Hayes moved in circles of power and influence. But despite their differences, the memory of her warmth lingered. She hadn't looked at him with pity or disdain, as so many others had. She had seen him as a person, and that, more than anything, stayed with him. The shelter buzzed with renewed activity as people resumed their conversations, but Marcus remained rooted in his chair, his thoughts racing. He pulled out the card, running his thumb over the embossed lettering. "Victoria Hayes," he murmured again. the name carrying a weight he couldn't ignore. The question now wasn't whether she remembered him, it was whether he had the courage to reach out. Did he dare step into her world, even for a moment? As he slipped the card back into his pocket, Marcus resolved to think about it later. For now, he had more immediate concerns: finding work, securing a meal, and surviving another day. But deep down, he knew this wasn't the end of their story. The sun peeked through the clouds over the city, casting a rare warmth on the busy streets. Marcus Reed sat on a bench near the shelter, scribbling lines of music into his weathered notebook. He had spent the morning searching for odd jobs, as he often did, but the previous night's news still lingered in his mind. He replayed Victoria Hayes's press conference over and over, her poised demeanor a stark contrast to the drenched and vulnerable woman he had guided through a storm. As much as he tried to focus on his present, he couldn't shake the thought of her and the card she had given him. Probably just being polite, he muttered to himself, closing his notebook with a sigh. As if summoned by his thoughts, a sleek black car pulled up in front of the park. Marcus sat up, his curiosity piqued. The car's tinted window rolled down, revealing a sharply dressed man with a warm but professional demeanor. "Are you Marcus Reed?" the man asked, stepping out of the car. Marcus hesitated, his instincts telling him to be cautious. "Yeah," he said finally, his voice tinged with suspicion. "I'm David, Ms. Hayes's assistant," the man said, extending a business card. "She'd like to meet with you." Marcus blinked, momentarily at a loss for words. "Victoria Hayes?" he asked, as if there could be any other. David nodded. "She asked me to personally invite you to her office. She wants to thank you properly for what you did." The ride to Hayes Enterprises was surreal. Marcus sat stiffly in the back seat, his eyes scanning the city as they moved toward the towering glass building that housed the corporation. He felt out of place, his worn jacket and jeans a stark contrast to the polished environment he was about to enter. When they arrived, David led him through the lobby, the sleek marble floors gleaming under the soft light. Marcus couldn't help but glance at his reflection in the spotless walls, feeling more aware than ever of the gap between their worlds. "She's waiting for you," David said with a reassuring smile, gesturing toward a set of double doors. Marcus hesitated for a moment, then stepped inside. Victoria Hayes stood by the window, her silhouette framed by the city skyline. When she turned, her face lit up with a warm smile. "Marcus," she said, her voice genuine and welcoming. "I'm so glad you came." "Ms. Hayes," he replied awkwardly, his hands stuffed into his pockets. "Victoria," she corrected gently, crossing the room to shake his hand. "Please, have a seat." As they sat across from each other, Victoria's expression softened. "I've been thinking a lot about that night," she began. "About what you did for me. And for my baby." Marcus shrugged, his voice humble. "You were in trouble. I just did what anyone would have done." "No," Victoria said firmly. "What you did most people wouldn't. You put yourself at risk to help a stranger. That kind of kindness, it's rare." Her words hung in the air, and Marcus shifted uncomfortably, unsure how to respond. Victoria leaned forward, her tone earnest. "I don't know if you realize how much that night changed things for me. It made me see things differently. About my life, my work, the way I've been living in my own bubble. You reminded me of something I'd lost sight of. The humanity that connects all of us." Marcus met her gaze, his guarded expression softening. "That's why I wanted to see you," Victoria continued, "to offer you something more than just gratitude." She slid a folder across the desk. "In here are a few options: a job at Hayes Enterprises, housing assistance, or funding for any project you want to pursue, whether it's music, a business idea, anything. I want to help you get back on your feet, Marcus." Marcus stared at the folder, his mind racing. It was everything he hadn't dared to hope for, presented to him on a silver platter. But along with the excitement came doubt. "Why me?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "There are so many people who need help more than I do." Victoria's smile was gentle. "Because you helped me when you didn't have to. And because I believe in paying it forward. If we can start with you, maybe that ripple will grow." For a long moment, Marcus sat in silence, grappling with the weight of her offer. His pride urged him to refuse, to stand on his own 2 feet as he always had. But another part of him, the part that longed for a second chance, knew this could be the opportunity he'd been waiting for. "All right," he said finally, his voice steady. "I'll accept your help. But only if I can earn it." Victoria's eyes brightened. "That's exactly the kind of attitude I was hoping for." As they stood to shake hands, Marcus felt a surge of something he hadn't felt in years. Hope. "You're giving me a lot," he said, his tone sincere. "I won't let you down." "I know you won't," Victoria replied. "And I hope you know this isn't just about what I'm giving you. You reminded me of what really matters, Marcus. You've given me just as much as I'm giving you." The melody drifted through the room like a soft breeze, the notes rich and warm as Marcus's fingers glided over the piano keys. The small crowd in the community center sat spellbound, their conversations hushed as they watched him play. For Marcus, it was more than a performance. It was a rediscovery of a part of himself he thought he'd lost forever. The piano had been a gift from Victoria Hayes, one of many ways she had helped him rebuild his life. Months ago, he couldn't have imagined standing here, let alone inspiring others. Now, as he looked out over the audience, he felt a deep sense of gratitude and purpose. Since their fateful encounter, Marcus had embraced the opportunities Victoria offered. Through her connections, he'd been able to secure a job at Hayes Enterprises, working in a mentorship program that focused on empowering disadvantaged youth. By day, he helped young people learn skills to rebuild their lives. By night, he returned to his music, pouring his heart into compositions that reflected his journey. The transition hadn't been easy. Marcus had carried years of doubt and insecurity, wondering if he truly deserved a second chance. But with each small success, a new skill mastered, a student's breakthrough, a song completed, his confidence grew. He began to see himself not just as someone who had survived, but as someone who could thrive. "I didn't just want to take," Marcus often said to those who asked about his story. "I wanted to give back. That's the only way this works." Across the room, Victoria sat near the back, watching Marcus with a proud smile. She hadn't expected their paths to intertwine the way they had. But meeting Marcus had been a turning point for her too. Before the stormy night that brought them together, Victoria had been so consumed by the demands of running Hayes Enterprises that she'd lost touch with the very values her company claimed to uphold. The experience had forced her to confront how insulated she'd become in her privileged world. Reflecting on Marcus's kindness and resilience had reshaped her priorities. She had doubled down on her philanthropic efforts, launching new programs to support housing, education, and employment for underserved communities. "I thought I was helping him," she often said to her colleagues, "but he ended up helping me see what really matters." As Marcus's final note lingered in the air, the audience erupted into applause. He stood and offered a small, humble bow, his face glowing with a quiet pride. Afterward, as people filtered out, Marcus found himself standing with Victoria. "You were incredible up there," she said, her voice warm and sincere. Marcus chuckled, shaking his head. "I just played a few notes." "You played more than notes," Victoria said, her gaze steady. "You reminded everyone in that room of what's possible." They stood in silence for a moment, both reflecting on how far they'd come since that stormy night. "You know," Marcus said thoughtfully, "it's funny how things work out. If my life had been different, maybe I never would have been in that place at that time. And if I hadn't broken down on that road," Victoria added, "I might never have seen the kind of courage and compassion you showed me." Marcus smiled. "Guess we were both in the right place at the right time then." As they parted ways that evening, Marcus felt a renewed sense of purpose. He wasn't just surviving anymore. He was building a life that mattered, both for himself and for others. Victoria, too, left with a sense of fulfillment. She knew the world couldn't be changed overnight, but she also knew that small acts of kindness could ripple outward, creating impacts far greater than anyone could imagine. Their story was proof that even in the darkest of storms, hope could shine through, and that sometimes the most extraordinary change begins with the simplest act of bravery. This heartwarming story shows how a single act of kindness can transform lives in ways you'd never expect. If Marcus and Victoria's journey inspired you, share this video with someone who believes in the power of compassion and second chances. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more stories that celebrate humanity, resilience, and the extraordinary impact of everyday heroes. What act of kindness could you do today?